firstly, I'm going to ask for Alicia to come and do the first presentation about her experience with the complaints process linked to service charges. Over to you, Alicia. Nice to have you here.
So a little bit about me. I spent over 30 years working volunteering in community development in rural Essex and Suffolk. And nowadays, when time and health allows, I write about my lifestyle and I campaign for reforms in social policy around disability, poverty and social housing. My landlord is Havebury Housing Partnership. It's a housing association with about 7,500 properties in the east of England, predominantly in Suffolk. I first became a social housing tenant with them 7 years ago, having lost my home twice in short succession. I was invited to become a part of Shelter's new National Lived Experience group, which I did for about a year, as well as doing some virtual volunteering with my local branch of Shelter in Norwich, working with the social prescribing team. 2 years ago, I was a successful candidate for the position of Vice Chair of Havebury's new Tenants Experience Committee, which replaced the former Tenants Panel. I had a role in its development, as well as being given a place on the board. This new committee has a closer relationship with and oversight of operations within Havebury. But this evening, I've been invited to talk specifically about my experience of challenging service charges within my housing association. I've used this experience to create a sort of template which others can now use and which I draw on when I'm talking to other residents. So first, some general points. Next slide, please, Helen. Firstly, are you actually liable for service charges? At Havebury, as in many other housing associations, most former council tenants don't pay service charges because of their preserved rights. However, I've found tenants who are paying them when they shouldn't be. The most important thing is they must be set out in your tenancy agreement. I've included examples of such paragraphs in my own tenancy agreement, and you will be getting copies of the relevant slides to look at more closely in your own time. So if, Helen, you could just briefly go through the next 3 slides. I haven't got anything to say about them. So the focus of my complaint. I can't pretend that this started out as a service charge complaint. Instead, ahead of the rent and service charge increases I knew I was about to be asked to agree to as a board member, I wanted to draw attention to these 3 areas I knew to be a particular concern to me and other residents. My argument was going to be that this year, before I would agree to further increases, we needed to look more carefully to check the residents were getting everything they were paying for. I wanted us to promise a review of service charges. I won't go into more detail here, but the upshot was that I resigned my positions on the committee and the board and decided to go ahead with the complaint about these areas of concern instead. While it was made clear to me that I could only make a complaint on my own behalf, I couldn't represent others because it's the way things are done here at Havebury. I knew that if I made the challenge, others could follow. Since the recent changes in legislation, while Havebury and others will continue to deal with complaints individually, the Ombudsman, and I have checked this with the Ombudsman, will now consider the same complaint from several tenants grouped together for his consideration after it's been through stage 2 of our complaints process, if no resolution has been found. This has led to me very recently explaining the importance to Havebury tenants, perhaps on one estate in particular, of ensuring that all their individual complaints are worded similarly and with a similar objective to make it easier for the Housing Ombudsman to make a judgment. Next slide, please, Helen.
Yep. 1 second.
The parameters within which a complaint about service charges can be made to the Ombudsman are fairly narrow and well defined, so any initial complaint should be made with this in mind. Next slide, please, Helen. This was going to be the area that I would centre my complaint around, the level of service provided for a fee. And next slide, please. In other words, charges for service which haven't been carried out to an acceptable standard, or charges for which I felt I'd been incorrectly charged. In other words, when I've been charged for something that I hadn't actually got at all, and that has actually come up. Next slide, please, Helen. So I began by looking at my last statement of service charges. My first question was, how did fly tipping fit into it? And I knew fly tipping, as I said before, is an issue for people. The other thing to mention here is these costs are estimates only, which is why I encourage tenants to keep an accurate record of the services they receive if they think they might want to make a challenge. We can and do receive refunds, and I've had them, which will show as adjustments on next year's bill, but the likelihood is that you'll need to show evidence. I didn't have all the evidence I could have gathered, and I know now that I paid for services I didn't receive. Next slide, please, Helen. As mentioned before, former council tenants don't pay these charges. In my block, 3 out of 4 tenants pay, and the costs for the former council tenant are theoretically absorbed by Havebury. But you'll see later, this hasn't strictly been the case. Some areas of our service charges do impact on the rest of us financially, which I discovered when I asked for a breakdown of my charges. Next slide, please, Helen. We are entitled to we're all entitled to a breakdown of the service charges under Section 21 of the Landlord and Tenant Act, which gives us the right to seek a summary of relevant service charge costs during the previous accounting period, which is usually the previous year. You can take this further, I didn't need to, and ask to inspect the documents relating to your service charges within a period of 6 months from the receipt of the summary under Section 22 of the same Act. This is my actual template for a complaint. It only needs to be in 2 parts, the elements of my complaint and my preferred outcome. I now encourage other tenants to do the same, and have already used it myself, again just recently, for a complaint about ASB in relation to disability rights. I think it clarifies your expectations for your landlord, so there's no place for smoke and mirrors or ignoring parts of what you're asking in their response. You simply tick off the successes while looking for a different approach for those areas where there's still more work to be done, or escalate the complaint to stage 2. In my case, I took the concerns I still had about the door system and reintroduced them as part of the complaint I spoke about earlier, in light of the recent Ombudsman spotlight on more equal relationships. Next slide, please, Helen. The first part, and my complaint, as I say, this is the first section. My complaint would just have a paragraph about each of these issues. If you remember, I'd identified these when I was still a board member, and now they've become the elements of my complaint. By the way, it's only when I received a detailed breakdown that I found exactly what I was being charged for when it came to fly tipping, and that one's the one, I think, one of the main issues that's come out of this. Next slide, please. I couched these elements in terms which could ensure the Ombudsman could investigate if I wasn't happy with the outcome of any stage 2 complaint, if necessary. So once again, as I said before, services which haven't been carried out to an acceptable standard, and charges that I don't think I should have been charged in the first place. Next slide, please, Helen. When it came to grounds maintenance, the contractors responsible for ground maintenance were cutting more corners than they were actually cutting grass and hedges in our communal spaces. We all knew it. I also knew this was a situation where residents were pushing against a partly open door, and had already encouraged them all, if affected, to make an official complaint, and they did. Quite a few of them actually got compensation for it. I felt that it had been so bad over the past year, we should all have a sizable reduction in what we'd paid. I wasn't so successful on that bit. I also discovered that I'd been charged for the bin cleaning service that I'd never received. But because I didn't know from my bill I was being charged for bin cleaning, I couldn't do anything about it. I obviously can now. Unfortunately, as well, I was so busy helping others to complain that I didn't collect the evidence I needed to actually make a good argument about my grounds maintenance, and I didn't make a complaint at the time via the official system, and this will be reflected in their response. This is an area where perhaps they got off a bit lightly, I still think. Next slide, please, Helen. Fly tipping. This turned out to be the most meaty part of my complaint, considering fly tipping hadn't even appeared on my summary of service charges. The biggest frustration for me and other tenants was the way in which we passed around if we reported fly tipping or tried to report fly tipping. And this is not just housing associations, the council, no one wanted to know. And I wanted more clarity as to who was actually paying when items were being taken away. And if you remember, I said about former council tenants didn't pay service charges. Well, it also seemed that these same tenants were unaware or indifferent to the fact that the items they dumped weren't just taken away for free, and then that their neighbours were paying for items which they left in our bin store or in our communal areas. The last year, one of the neighbour in particular actually did a whole house clearance, which I'm making sure that Avebury know I'm not going to pay for that one. But the year before I was talking about, I could trace all 4 items for which I've been charged the previous year, which came up in when I got the detailed breakdown of costs. 3 of them were dumped by the former council tenant, in all cases outside his door. It made me wonder if anyone was actually bothering to check who was responsible. It almost seemed to me that we'd got into sort of drifted into a system where the 3 tenants who paid service charges covered the cost. I'm not suggesting anything there, but make your mind up yourself. Hold on a second. I was also extremely unhappy about the rash of talk notice, which I felt were being used incorrectly. As you probably know, talk notice are most likely to be used by landlords to prevent residents from storing items in cupboards or other communal areas in order to reduce fire risks and to allow residents to evacuate safely in an emergency. However, in some instances, the items were clearly the responsibility of one tenant, but all 3 of us were potentially liable for the costs. For instance, items were being left outside the door of one of the upstairs flats, with the talk notice being posted on the front door downstairs and referencing flats 171 to 177. Similarly, there were repeated notices of one tenant who kept fishing gear in his boiler room. Now, these boiler cupboards are off the communal hallway, but they're kept locked by tenants, and we all have individual keys. And I still question whether these are even communal areas. Next slide, please, Helen. This is one of the last talk notices we got. As you can see at the top, it says 171 to 177. Later on, it says 177. I questioned why they needed to actually put 171 to 177 at all when they knew exactly who was responsible. And I found out that they were actually being put through as 171, 177. Next slide, please, Helen. Finally, the issues around the door entry system. Both me and another neighbour would report faults and the doors would be broken again before the operative had left the estate. I soon discovered that we weren't the only ones in this situation, despite being led to believe that ours was a one-off problem. I wanted to ensure that we weren't being charged for these repairs in our service charges when they resulted from repeated incidents of antisocial behaviour, and that we weren't being charged for a service we didn't get. The truth was the doors would lock tenants and their visitors out while allowing others who weren't tenants to enter the block any time of the day or night. And the reasons they were coming, I won't say why they were coming to the flat, but they weren't exactly totally legal reasons. Next slide, please. So this is my list of my preferred outcomes. This is the second part of my complaint. Some were a bit cheeky, others were more of a starting point for further discussion, but I think this is the key to a successful challenge. I tell tenants there's no point just saying you want the service to get better, which is what we all tend to say. You're not happy with the service. You need to make it clear what you think the solution would be to make the service satisfactory, to make the service something that you're being charged for. and always ask for a review of charges and possible compensation if you think it's relevant. And I do encourage people, there's no point asking for compensation. There's no point not asking for compensation. I tend to tell everyone to ask, and if you don't ask, you don't get. Next slide, please, Helen. Their response, the first bit was about grounds maintenance, and as I've already said, it's most disappointing bit, and I've only got myself to blame because I didn't take my own advice and make a complaint with evidence. What I'd done, because I was too busy pestering them in order to get compensation for other tenants, I'd actually got a friend to cut back the hedges and the brambles myself. It turned out they'd sent a neighbourhood ranger round to check the work, and they'd reported back that the work was done. It's my friend that had done it. So as I say, it's my fault and I wouldn't do it again. However, the service has been taken in-house, which I already knew was going to be happening. And I knew I played a part in keeping the pressure on. So this is part of a process. And we're now at the point that we're kind of 6 months in, and it's keeping the pressure on, even though it's now been taken in-house. The information about the 12-week inspection is something I have stored up for future reference if needed. I do tend to check that I have the people coming round. Just to add at this point, with this complaint, they must log in and acknowledge your complaint within 5 working days. They then have a further 10 working days to respond for stage 1. If you want to escalate it to stage 2, you must let them know within 20 days, telling them why you're still dissatisfied. Their response to my whole, my complaint came just before the office closed on the 10th working day. And I think this is one of the areas where we can wind each other up if we're not careful, because I thought they were doing it deliberately. And it was just before Christmas, and I knew it would take my response time into the period between Christmas and New Year. So I thought they'd done it just to be a bit awkward. It was only when I actually looked at the length of the response, I could see that it involved personnel from 3 different departments. There'd been some cutting and pasting in the reply, and that also I could see that there was a action sheet that they'd circulated between themselves, which clearly said that some areas were not to be forwarded to me, and they had accidentally forwarded them to me. So I actually saw the workings, behind the scenes, and I could see that some of the response had been questioned by others involved themselves. So they weren't totally happy, and they knew that there are some areas which they needed to look at further. But in many ways, I wish that they had been able to tell me that the complexity meant the response might take a bit longer. Yes, I got some more information than I perhaps would have done, but it was, as I say, there was some cutting and pasting, and I felt some of it felt a bit rushed. I think it would have been sensible if we got together to agree between ourselves that they responded perhaps at the start of January. The regulations are good in the way that they give us a minimum expectation, but they don't allow staff and tenants to work together. The other recent change is we now have 12 months to escalate a complaint to the Ombudsman, where it's previously 6 months. 12 months to escalate a complaint, where from when it originally happened, forget the Ombudsman bit, where it's previously 6 months, which I think is extremely good news in cases where multiple tenants are unhappy at the service charges, because it allows us to take time to standardise our complaints. And people post on the forum, someone says, oh, I'm not happy, this has happened. Someone else 2 days later will say, yes, the same thing happened to me. And now having that 12 months to complain means that we have much longer to actually get our act together. Next slide, please, Helen. And back to the fly tipping and their response. Please note the slightly condescending tone of the first paragraph, and remember this for later on. We look at this year's statement. We're unable to provide this level of granularity. And As for the principles of fly tipping investigation mentioned in the second paragraph, it turned out that what the people in the office thought was happening wasn't quite the same as what's actually happening on the ground. All I will say is, because I don't for one moment think it's done maliciously, was that they were called in for some staff training and revisions were made to their working practices around tort notices, around actually investigating the investigating fly tipping, fly tip issues. I haven't actually seen a tort notice since, and I'm yet to see a flyer, but I wouldn't expect to, as I dispose of my unwanted items responsibly. Next slide, please. Door entry system. Now, this is a bit of a whoops moment for me, because they actually discovered we'd all been undercharged. But this does refer back to what I said about human error. This had happened sometime and no one had actually questioned it. The cost for door entry and the emergency lights were not only the wrong way round, which didn't actually matter because the cost for both is the same, but it turned out they service the lights twice a year. So unfortunately, it means that we all now pay more. They offered me £10 compensation, which I didn't accept, even though I just saved them thousands, because I knew I'd be pursuing the door system under another complaint. Plus, everyone in the block had been offered compensation when I first issued my complaint, which actually represented 3 times the cost of the annual door entry check. So, we're all compensated for that in a different way. Next slide, please, Helen. So, was it all worth it, and what did it achieve? Next slide. Personally, this year, my weekly service charge bill is down by 20% on last year. That's despite the increase in charges for the emergency lights, and that is a refund on last year's estimate. Do you remember I said before these are all estimated, and I think it's important we always remember that, plus a small reduction in the estimated costs of some services next year. And these tend to be all the areas that I investigated in my complaint, so they have actually listened, bless them. Next slide, please, Helen. Can you remember their comment about they're unable to provide this level of granularity? Well, you can see the service charges this year that's on your right. Well, it seems they can provide this level of granularity because they have separated fly tipping in this year's statement, which makes it easier for everyone to see what they're paying and what the charges are for. And bearing in mind this fly tipping was so controversial, I have a feeling it's going to cause a bit of controversy. And finally, the next slide. The biggest thing, I think it's got us all talking to each other again, listening and learning from each other. I don't do this because I want forever to be telling people what to do. I want other people to learn to do it for themselves. My favourite bit of all is the thing that I love most of everything is when I see a tenant that I've given advice to offering the same advice to someone else. Plus, just last week, I saw a fellow tenant who'd been part of one of my conversations online about grounds maintenance some months ago, warning Havebury that he would be checking his service charges carefully because he didn't think the new grounds maintenance service was satisfactory. I can't pretend to be able to offer you specific advice on your own circumstances, and I know Paul will be filling in gaps in my knowledge and helping with any questions, but I hope it encourages a few more of you to try making your own challenge.
Now we're going to have a presentation from Ibrahim Pipadi, who is involved in tenants' rights and leaseholder rights and how to dispute service charges.
Okay, just a bit about myself. I mean, I've had the best of both worlds. I've been a tenant, I've been a leaseholder, or I currently am like a leaseholder, and I also work in housing and have done so. I grew up in Norwich, but I don't live in Norwich now. So given that we had a bit of a theme of locations, I'm in West London these days, but also did live in Basildon and Chatham in Kent as well. And in effect, what I've seen over the years is just growing through experience in terms of there has now been, in my view, an increase of rights for leaseholders and tenants, specifically around service charges and also rents as well. The first area that I'd like to cover is basically, it's called the Section 22 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, which was covered really good in a previous presentation as well. And basically what it is that the freeholder should provide you with a summary of service charge costs for the last accounting period. So if you say like you've got a variable service charge and you're a leaseholder or shared owner, you should be able to, after you receive your summary in writing within 6 months, your freeholder has to provide you with reasonable facilities, as it's called, to inspect the accounts, receipts, and any other supporting documents, to take copies and extracts from those documents. So again, from the previous presentation, we were talking about the various elements of service charges and things that, if say they can't prove, then it's your right to challenge them and say, well, where's the invoice for this? How do you know that that was accounted for? Where is that on your ledger? And I can acknowledge and see that there are some frustrations from leaseholders and tenants about this. Well, what is it that you can do if they're not giving you the information that you're requesting because you're entitled to it? So in effect, the landlord has up to 1 month after the request to provide this to you. And if they don't do that, then it is actually a criminal offence if they fail to comply with this Section 22, and if they haven't got a reasonable excuse. And the offence carries a maximum penalty of 6 months imprisonment, which I don't think is realistic for that, but they can incur a fine of up to £2,500 for not complying. Sometimes there is some issues around how do you enforce that, because sometimes not all local authorities can do that. But there has been discussions from some good solicitors and some good legal persons that have said that sometimes there has been instances where a tenant or a leaseholder has been able to even take a private summons against their freeholder. So in effect, what I'm trying to get at here is that it is your right to request documents to see what you're paying for. If you could kindly move to the next slide, please. Thank you. And touching again from the previous presentation, which was brilliantly outlining around the Housing Ombudsman, the specific bit for me that comes out from the Housing Ombudsman, which was produced around about a few months ago, is the service charge spotlight report extract, which I've taken from that specific document. And it says this: where residents request additional information, such as invoices, the Ombudsman expects landlords to comply with Sections 21, in this instance, as I mentioned, Sections 22 and 23 of the Landlord Act and Tenant Act 1985. Even where these provisions do not apply, such as, say, where it could be something within the lease or it could be something in the tenancy, but that's my view, it's unlikely. It may still be appropriate to provide relevant and additional information to a resident to assist them in understanding the charge. So not only before, for a number of years, have you had that magistrates court enforcement, if, say, you were to make a complaint, again, from the previous presentation, which outlined, say, at stage 1 or stage 2, if the Ombudsman sees that that the landlord has not provided you with something that you have requested information for, that can lead to maladministration. And I'd very much recommend to everyone, if you do get the chance, to do have a look at that Housing Ombudsman Service Charge Spotlight report, because in there it will give you case examples and case studies of certain landlords of where they didn't comply. So there's an example of one landlord in there. They were supposed to even get the managing agent information. They failed to do that, and the landlord said, and the Housing Ombudsman stated, that's not acceptable. They can say that there may be a systematic failure if it keeps on occurring and occurring and occurring and again, and they will carry out a special investigation, as you may also have seen on some other landlords that have not lived up to the expectations that should have been achieved.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Ibrahim. That was a really great sort of combination of the real personal journey and then how that fits right in the heart of the bigger picture, and I think that's really powerful.